started. All right, and to be honest, from my side, I don't have a lot this week. I don't think I got to the 2 items that I wanted to do last week, which are overdue as well, which was send out those emails about the RFCs, as well as the tools def. And like I said earlier, I didn't even get to the meeting notes, unfortunately. I will get those up after this meeting tonight. So from my side, it's pretty short. Is there anyone that has any opens for the week?
Yeah, Sean. I have one question about. I remember you mentioned you are working on the how to say container-based development environment.
Yep.
Okay. Do you have plan to create a or you plan to release your Dockerfile or something like that to standardize that environment and create some upstream, Dockerfile release in the open source community?
Great question. And I think, Mike, I'd turn around and ask you a little bit here. Do you think it's worth creating a new repo under TianoCore and adding the Docker file there, using GitHub Actions or something to build the container, and using GitHub registry to store the container?
Yeah, that's my question. Because because that will sterilize the compiler version, nascent version, and we can based on it to build our internal Dockerfile and extra more tools. Yeah, I hope to know the process. I hope to know the plan. So
I would encourage us to look at what other open source projects have done for how they manage their Docker profiles. Is it in the same repo as the source code, or is it in a separate repo and availability? Just because we shouldn't reinvent the wheel here, right? I'm sure others have figured out a good way to go do this and manage it. The other thing I'll mention is I recall when Stefano was the community manager for TianoCore, he actually implemented a couple Docker profiles. They may have been more Linux focused as far as the agent type, but he at least got that work started, but I forget where those got posted.
Okay.
There may be email in groups.io that archive that has that discussion in it.
Okay, that'd be good to look up. We have one that is now passing for Project Mu for the GCC on Linux environment. I think it's still bigger than we'd like, so we were doing a little more optimization this last week. It is up in public. It is hosted under one of the developers' name on GitHub.io, and so, or sorry, not GitHub.io, Docker Hub. And so we were thinking, again, tonight it was going to be a question to the group here of uploading it to TianoCore and the GitHub registry. We were, from our side, from the Microsoft side, we were looking, but we have a lot of restrictions around containers and where we host them. And so I think it'd be easier if we actually hosted them on TianoCore, and I think it's more appropriate anyways. And so I wondered if that's an option to use the GitHub registry under the TianoCore organization.
Yeah, I'm just looking at their documentation just for the first time at this minute on this concept of the registry at GitHub. It looks like an interesting idea. So as I said, I'd see if like we see, I don't know how much, is there a way to query the current registry to see how many things are in there?
It probably is. I've always seen it scoped by the owner. So instead of being a big wide open registry, I think it's more scoped by the organization and project.
Okay.
Where I think Docker Hub maybe is a little more wide open. But yeah, I've used it personally for some things, and it seems to make sense for this, and following the spirit of trying to get things easy and aligned on GitHub. I think it makes sense.
So maybe for this audience, Sean, do you think it'd be worthwhile to have a short demo from the developer that's been working on this to show what the developer experience is using a Docker profile to do a build, to set up an environment and do a build?
I think that makes sense. I guess though, one thing is we're looking at it from providing the CI environment. So a little bit less than the developer scenario. I think Oliver from Red Hat was adding additional packages that when he was doing this, and he's been trying this. There's some in the discussion from him, and there's some links to his own repos where he's created the Docker file and stuff. And there was a little discussion around that. He's added more content, I think, because he wants the developer, container.
Mm-hmm.
So it has more things. I think what we were looking at, which is slightly different, is getting the smallest container possible for CI so that we waste as little time as possible.
Got it. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that kind of really, emphasizes the need maybe for a separate repository with a family of Docker profiles that we can pick and choose, some for CI, some for developers, and different developers may have different tools they like. And so, maybe different options will show up over time as developers look at this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something like the Dockerfile market, right? I mean, not real market, but some release options, and let the developers choose and customize.
Yeah, no, I think it would be very useful, and it would. We're looking at it also, just for FYI, is we've had a number of problems with the ARM developer website where we download the ARM and ARM64 compilers for CI. Over the last year, we've had some troubles there, and we're looking at if we move it inside the container, then we won't have to download that. And if we're using GitHub, our hope is that those services are reliable and we'll have fast access to them.
Yeah, like the PyTorch and other, EDK2 tools. Sometimes we need a whole environment to crack them all. To build them piece by piece. Sometimes it's painful and costs a lot of effort and bring many mistakes. So I do believe OS environment like a Dockerfile is a good idea. That will make things easier and easier for us to, if we want to integrate a useful tool suite together.
Yeah.
And just because I just don't know a lot about the Windows version of this, these are Linux focused as their original ones, but is there a Windows container option as well here?
So we tried a couple of years ago, and we were pretty disappointed with the size of the container. Maybe the size isn't the most important thing for a model where we're really just trying to, collect all the external dependencies and keep them in sync. And so I could play with that again. It probably wouldn't be for CI. It might be for the developer scenario.
Okay.
But right now, yes, it is a Linux container, but you can use WSL and then use a Linux container within WSL. So you can use it on both Windows and Linux. There are obviously, I think as we briefly mentioned last week, there are some file system constraints where if you're using it as a local development scenario, you probably want to do the clone within the Docker container, or at least within the WSL instance, so you don't have the overhead of the file system.
Right, and then for you do file editing from the Windows side into the WSL container, right? Because that direction works as well, but it has performance issues for builds, but the editing performance is probably reasonable.
Yep. And if you use VS Code, there's the VS Code remote plugins that plug right into those containers.
For the Windows container, does that container offer some graphic GUI or desktop environment, or just like only some test mode like the Linux?
We were only doing text So I don't know the answer to that for sure. That is a good question. I think Docker on Windows, and again, I haven't done it in a couple of years now, so and this is kind of a changing space. I think Docker on Windows only did a text command console, but I'm definitely not an expert there. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be interesting to explore what's available, because I know that there is a set of developers that prefer Windows as a development environment and want to use things like Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code and use the Visual Studio compilers. So, in order to support those kinds of developers, if there was an easy way to set up the environment through something like Docker, that'd be good.
Yeah. And again, the PyTool project does kind of help make that a little easier with some of the external dependencies, but yes, it's not as nice as a Docker container, I think. So I guess, Mike, before you head out, it might make sense to try to see if we can make that repo if that's what we need. Or do you have a backup admin that can do that?
Yeah. So Mickey is an admin.
Okay.
And there are others as well. They'll check who the other few are. Lemming is also an admin on Tanacore.
Okay. I'll put a link in the chat if that works for people. There is a discussion. I think at the moment it has only been Oliver and I discussing, but that's his work, and it points to his images and his Docker file. And you can find that in the Tanacore discussion. And then, like I said, we can submit the work that we've been doing to try to enable the CI scenario. But I think it makes sense to chime in there if anyone has opinions.
Mike, do you have anybody from the OTC team that has more experience with the Docker? I've dug up some of the really old mails. Stefano used to be in our group, right? And all the people that he was talking to. So I think they had like Bailey Park 1610. Mike, that was the tool chain they were using to try and get that Stefano had gotten into. I think it was Ubuntu 16.04. So most of the people are gone, I think. Rocky and those people, right? They're not around anymore.
Yeah, but the email threads that may have been on Tanacore from Stefano may be valuable just for some of the things they learned in case there's something that we're, a corner case we're missing in trying to set this up. But as Sean said, this is a moving target as far as the features of Docker. So though that old information may not be very valuable, it just may have some use case.
I think it's way too old from an ancient code base and an ancient set of tools we're not using anymore.
And you might have problems finding the mailing list because I think that's on o1.org, which no longer exists. So you might have to do some searching in archives and sites that like archive Tanacore.
That's what I'm saying. I think digging through the old archives and some ancient old base, I don't think is worth the effort. That's what I was asking Kenny. Is there somebody in OTC that you're talking to who is working with Docker now? You were alluding to earlier.
I've not discussed Docker with anybody.
So let me go see if I can find somebody who's actively working with toolchain or using Docker in their build environment, at least on the Linux side.
Okay. And just FYI, we did when we moved from list01.org for our mailing list to groups.io, we did import all the archives from list01 into groups.io, so all that information should be there.
But that's in that web-based thread thing. You got to search unless there's some sort of app, right? You have to search through it manually by thread, month by month or whatever.
Yeah, I find it really clunky. I'm not
That's really
sure.
hard to find
Yeah.
stuff that way, especially going back several years. I don't know if there's an app or some sort of other
Well,
different interface, but the
If you
the
go to
mail
if you go to the web page, there's a list view and a thread view, and there's search capabilities. So it's
okay.
it's all there.
Yeah, I don't know if there might be an NTP interface that you can like import into Thunderbird or something.
So Rebecca, for the BSD environment, do you guys use Docker or any sort of container tools to sort of create your entire build setup environment?
No, on FreeBSD there's Jails instead, which is much preferred over Docker. Yeah, the problem a lot of us have with Docker is that it's proprietary.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll see if I can hunt somebody down who's actively using Docker for one of the other projects then.
Sure, sounds good. And we haven't yet looked at adding the RISC-V support in there as well. That would probably be another one we'd want to add.
Well, Stefano might be interested then, since he's kind of like the RISC-V. He left to go start the RISC-V group in the Linux Foundation. So he might have an interest in putting it back for a RISC-V. I don't know.
I'm only saying that because I think our current CI we pull in the RISC-V compiler like we do GCC for ARM64, and so I think again we'd want to pull that in. It hasn't been a problem, and I think that's because it's hosted on GitHub. But yeah, it still would make sense to pre-populate the environment as much as possible. And Harry, if you can redirect him to that discussion on TianoCore, that's probably the easiest way. Or
Sure.
Of course, the mailing list exists too. Yeah.
And we can always ask him what's the easiest way with today's tools. So I know there's, even on their side, there's a lot of all these different tools that they use for their automated environments for building projects.
Sounds good. Other open topics? Things anyone in the group wants to bring up? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else,
Sean, just before I forget, so for the tool chain, you were looking into the Visual Studio 2022, the newer one. Have you gotten around to playing with the newer tool chain?
So it works. We have updated the Visual Studio plugin to support it. We just need to get those changes pushed out to the list.
Okay.
They're pretty trivial, and I think it didn't even have any code breakage. There was no, new castings required or any of those kind of changes that are often needed.
Okay. And is that the community version? The only thing we're really using from there is the Visual MSVC compiler. I mean, are there other things that we're using out of the tool chain?
There is the build tools. Oh, there is. Okay, sorry. There is a couple rough edges right now. And so I guess it probably isn't encouraged to move the CI there just yet. That is because there's not a new DDK or WDK for Windows 11, and therefore the GitHub, the Azure DevOps build agents don't have the WDK tools installed, and therefore you basically can't build Windows drivers or system firmware. And there is a couple things that we do that use those tools. I think the resource compiler is one example. And so I don't think they're available on the image that has Visual Studio 2022. So I think we'd wait until that becomes available, which should be any moment now. We just haven't seen it yet.
Okay. So does the community version, the WDK and SDK, is that part? I thought those are separate things.
Those are separate downloads.
Yeah. Right.
But now, so again, I think any local developer could very easily use Visual Studio 2022. It is that the CI that we use, those images don't have the right tools installed yet.
And each VM image only supports the corresponding Visual Studio version is like the issue, right? Because they don't support it. It's not like we can use the 19 image and use Visual Studio 2022. It basically upgrade you to the Windows 2022 image, which doesn't have those on there, but it does have Visual Studio 2022.
So you're saying we need to create a whole new VM for the new tool chain then, right?
Until they update their image, if we wanted to. But I think the plan is to just stay on 19 until the image gets updated to have the WDK on it, things.
Well, if we figure out a Windows container for the 2022, it is easier for the developer to use it.
Yeah, that's true.
Because then we have this thing where, right, you need to kill an older version of the Visual Studio tools, or do we really want to have 3 or 4 versions of Visual Studio? Is it easier just to take the Docker environment or and sort of capture and freeze the tools? I mean, is there anything newer from Visual Studio 2022 that we really need?
So Harry, this gets into the conversation of what do we need for CI versus what do we need for developers? We're pretty clear that for CI, we want to move to the newest possible tools in general, exception given for compatibility issues that we have to work through before we can move to the newest one. And because we can't afford the execution time, we don't want to run, several versions of Visual Studio or several versions of GCC and CI. We want to pick one of the newer ones for each, and possibly expand to Clang. That's the other thing that we're adding for CI. For individual developers, it's our observation that there's a number of companies that build products that use TianoCore as some of their content, and they tend to be more conservative on their transition to new tool chains. And so for developer use cases, we have to have a clear understanding of what all the developers are using for the downstream consumers of TianoCore. And it would be good if we're going to go on this Docker profile exercise that we have profiles for the various ones that developers are actually using. And it may be that developers that use them are the ones that need to help produce those Docker profiles. And then there should always be a sliding scale where at some point where if there's developers that aren't using a tool chain at all anymore, then that's one that we could then remove from tools.txt.
Okay, so that's why having Docker would enable us to encapsulate the tool chains that people are actually using then.
Well, that should be captured elsewhere. Docker is to me, it's an accelerator for setting up your environment. And it should follow the approved, supported tool chains.
So ToolsDev should have the both supported and unsupported, but there's a best effort to keep them working, because I think we've still got Visual Studio 2008 in there.
Yeah, I think it's time to, if it's not actively used by anybody, I think it's time to delete them. We have to ask that question, because those profiles, if they're needed, they're still available in an older version of the code base, right?
Right. And
so,
I think last time I tried setting up Visual Studio 2012 to do some testing, it didn't work. Clearly nobody's using it because it's the build is just simply broken on the older builds.
Right. So I think that's also part of the conversation as well. Is not if somebody's using it, then it must be functional, right?
Yes.
So it's the ones that are actually being used and actually work are the ones. It could be that there's bugs, that there's ones that customers want to use, developers want to use, but they don't do it very often and are currently broken, and maybe they'll be committed to helping fix those issues. So that's why that has to be a conversation. But I think it is absolutely time to do a fresh assessment of that, and at least have the documented supported set for all developers and the documented set for CI that we keep as a very active front and center, whether it's in the README for the root of the repo or the wiki page, probably in the README to make it more clear. It's right there that here's the supported set, and as those change, that gets updated. And then tools def needs to follow. Now, I think Andrew Fish, when we talked about this a few weeks ago, expressed a concern that because of the way that the tool chains are defined in tools def, actually deleting an old tool chain may be challenging because of the inheritance properties of through the set of defines in the way tools def is implemented today. But I consider that more of there's just a work item to figure out how to remove the old ones without having any side effects on the currently supported ones. But it just may not be as trivial as deleting a few lines out of tools def.
So I just checked, and we've got the WinDDK defined, which was apparently released in 2003.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah, it's probably time for that to be removed.
Yep. We had to hang on to that one. We had to hang on to that one for a really long time because we had a dependency on the 16-bit linker for a long time in Tiano Core.
Wow, ouch.
For the SEC phase.
The plan was to send out an email to the larger list and ask for maintainers for each tool chain, and whatever doesn't get maintained, then a decision can be made. So I'm hoping that means a big cleaning, because I don't think there's going to be a lot of support coming forward. Definitely not for something like the 2003 DDK.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm kind of guessing people might still be using Visual Studio 2012 or 2015. But yeah, 2008, they should have migrated by now.
2015, I know for sure, is still being used. I'm hoping we can get rid of up to 2012 and 13.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe we can try to split the current single tool defined file to multiple ones. It become longer and longer. Right now it's over 200 kilobytes. So at least we can split it to some active support one and some old ones.
I don't think we should do that. If you want the old ones, they're in the history. Just delete them.
Oh, okay. Sometimes I'm thinking, when we are trying to add more tool chain, for example, like the Clang, they have 3 tool chains now. So there will be more and more new names tool chain be added in the future. I expect it. For example, some static analysis tool chains. So maintain them in a single tool defined file. Maybe it's not easy. I don't know whether we have some idea we can introduce multiple or even a folder to contain those tool chains.
We have talked about some ideas to deal with the fact that tools.def.txt is difficult to manage. And the main idea that we came up with was if you could define a new tool chain based upon an existing tool chain and just provide the deltas, like what are the flags added or flags removed to a few of the commands, that would get a very small tools def relative to today. And we were thinking something like regular expression syntax to be able to add and remove or replace options as you inherit from one to the other. So the idea, for example, for versions of Clang that do analysis, they would probably be based on the main Clang one with some extra flags. So you could do that in like 1 or 2 lines of text. So that's a concept that we haven't implemented at all, but it's one that we think is definitely possible to add as a new way of defining tools.def.txt.
Would there be any? I wonder if I wonder if we could possibly use some sort of build front end like CMake, which knows about all these tool chains and just like invokes build.py underneath it.
If you look at all of our compiler and linker flags, aren't they all special though for our firmware environment?
Yes. Well, I mean, not all of them, but yeah, a lot of them probably will be. Yeah, don't know.
Okay, you are suggesting whether we can support the CMake as a building for.
Yes.
Okay.
So, for example, in ARM platform PKG, there's a makefile that just simply invokes build. That's for the ARM Development Studio to invoke. So something like that. But no, it's probably not worth it actually.
Maybe, you know.
So Stephen, I
sometime-
think my feedback here is I think there's lots of opportunities to clean up tools dep and make it smaller overall from where it is today by just doing a proper inventory of what's actually used and reducing it down. And then I think there's further opportunities to make it simpler to maintain going forward, maybe with some either syntax extensions to the current one or an alternate syntax to the one that's there to be able to show that there's really close relationships between a large family of tool chains. And
yeah,
the other thing I have a question for Sean is around the ASL compiler. Are we still using both the ACPI CA one and the Microsoft one, or are we all consolidated to the ACPI CA ASL compiler?
I believe the Microsoft ASL compiler was removed a while ago.
Okay, because there's a bunch of tools definitions for using the Microsoft ASL one.
Oh, I thought those were removed.
Were they all gone? Okay.
Yeah, I think they were removed a couple years ago now. Because we have one project that does use that, and we have to add it back. That project carries its own version because of that.
Okay.
So the RVCT toolchain family can probably be removed because that's a 32-bit. It's only supported on 32-bit Windows and Linux, and yes, it's completely obsolete now.
So I'd like to just send out the email and basically, again, be very aggressive with removing things that no one stands up to and is willing to maintain. Like Mike said, you can go back in history and restore it if someone comes forward and says, "Oh, I really needed that and I missed the email." And chances are a lot of things could go away because I don't think people are willing to maintain them. So I'll be curious to see. Like I think what I've said in the past is we definitely would stand up and support 2019 and 2022. And I think, Intel probably is going to have to support that 2015 if they're going to hold on to that. So it'll be good to see, what people value and what they're willing to put resources behind maintaining.
There's also the EFI bytecode compiler. Is that still a thing?
I believe it's still available. So
okay,
I would recommend keeping EBC in there for right now. That's a more complicated conversation because there were discussions even at some of the previous conferences about doing a version of EBC based on the GCC compiler, and that was abandoned. The idea was abandoned. So the only EBC compiler available is the one that's defined in tools dep right now.
Right, and I looked at it. I looked at buying a copy, and I think it was the latest release was in like 2012.
That's correct.
Yeah, Mike, I'm not sure we still support the FlexAlm licenses, but we still support that. I don't know if that organization that was the software product still, if they can still get it or not. I'd have to go back and check because I'm not sure we still maintain that. And there's a corresponding interpreter that needs to match the compiler, and I have no idea You have to go hunt down and try and
No, it's
do
there.
some.
It's in the MD module package. The interpreter.
But there were several versions of the compiler, and I know there were some changes up to that point where it was sort of frozen or stopped, where they stopped development. So yeah, that's going back quite a ways.
Right. That's a broader topic about the idea of retiring EBC. That's more of a UEFI forum conversation.
Oh, definitely.
For the ACPI compiler, I hope to confirm. Maybe the question is to Sean. Is a standard open source the ACPI compiler is the only one formally supported by Windows, for example, Windows 11.
I think Microsoft still ships the MS ASL compiler, and therefore it would be considered supported. Whether it supports the features you need and works the way you like it, that's up to you to determine. I know that there are some proprietary unique features in it that some products use. That is why they're still using that. But and even whether that's a recommended path, you'd have to go look at the WDK or SDK, whatever produces that, to see. In the products that I work on, we try not to use it. I'll just leave it at that.
If I'm trying to define some test case to define some ACPI drivers, so the open source standard tool, the ACPI compiler is the only one we should use, or recommended to use. Is it correct? For example, if I want to define something in the UEFI share to test the ACPI, sometimes I need to. Sometimes I'm thinking whether we can porting the open source ACPI, tools into the share. But some people told me that Windows doesn't follow it. Windows sometimes use another compiler. So, so I hope to confirm that which one is the standard one. I mean the compiler and the tool.
So
then we can make it sure.
Yeah, I think what we can say is for EDK2 and its CI process, all those profiles use the ACPI CA compiler.
Okay.
When you want to talk about what ASL and AML is compatible with different operating systems, that's a conversation you have to have with the operating systems and their representation. I think they all have different levels of support for different things. And then if you want to talk about the tools, again, I think there's different products that can take different, have different requirements. But I think for EDK2 and its CI process, which is what we're basically talking about here, the ACPI CA compiler is the one that's being used.
And I think because I double checked, and you're absolutely right, Sean. It looks like the Microsoft ASL compiler was removed from tools def. So that, Sean, for Stephen, means even for developers that pull from Tiano Core right now, there is no built-in option to use the Microsoft ASL compiler.
Okay. Okay.
So Stephen, the Microsoft ASL team stopped updating even though the ACPI spec moved forward. Several years ago, they stopped updating the Microsoft ASL compiler. So only if you go talk to Robert Moore in the ACPI ASL and the UEFI forum, the ACPI group, when they come out with a new spec, like the next version of the spec, which is coming out soon, right? They're only going to update the ACPI CA ASL compiler. So the open source compiler. So if you have any requests, there's new things you need to add, you see things that need to be supported that you see in the spec, you need to make those requests to the ACPI subteam. That's the only compiler that's being updated right now.
Okay, that's good news to me.
Or that is a whole nother ball of wax, because I don't think that project takes requests very well. And if you look at what we use in CI, it's actually a fork of the ACPI-CA project, just to scare everyone.
Oh, great.
Yep.
So they're not taking a request. So I saw that both Eric and Robert Goff left. So I don't know if they're hurting for people. So let me go back and talk to Moore to find out if they are. So they're not honoring the requests from the mailing list or anything.
Let's just say we've had a lot of trouble. I guess at this point, I'm representing teams that have worked at Microsoft. I've had a lot of problems getting newer features in and features that make it compatible with newer compilers. And thus we have forked it, and it's public, you can see it. And that's where we pull our build, because our build has support for using Visual Studio 2019. There's probably changes that'll need for 2022, but they've been unwilling to take those changes.
Looks like they're taking pull requests and issues on GitHub.
If they do, that's news to me. So again, I guess my data could be 6 months old, so that's great.
Yeah, it looks like pull requests have been processed this year and issues have been entered this year.
Nice. Okay. We'll have to take another run at those.
Which is maybe if we believe that their support of ACPI-CA in GitHub is good, maybe we can get our CI process to directly use that content.
Yep. Are they well, I guess we can talk, I guess it makes sense here in the CI meeting, but do they have a released version of the tool that we can use?
I'm looking, well, it claims they have 102 tags. The last one was dropped 18 days ago. Previous one to that was March 11th, and then September of last year, July of last year. So yes, they do have a tag system for releases.
No builds though, it looks, well, let's see.
Source code. It looks like they have source code zips is what they have provided. So it's a SHA hash and the source code zips.
Yep.
I think they do their official binary releases on the ACPI-CA website.
Yeah, I see one, Mike, released for March 31st, 2022, excuse me. So
Yep.
Only 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Right. And they've got a tag for that, R033122. So that's always an interesting question from a tool perspective, Sean. If we have both a source project and they separately release binaries, what one should we be using for our CI and for our developers and these Docker kind of things? That's part of the, I think, assessment, especially around these Docker profiles, about what do we consider as the official version of every dependent tool.
Yep. I think that's why it makes sense to be able to have that as a repo. I think there is a whole worthy discussion around changes of that Docker file and how things are put together for the official images. Yeah. Okay, any other open topics?
I was wondering if we could at some point put together a plan for getting CI introduced over in EDK2 platforms, because I'm making a change now that's going to need all of the DSC files updated, which is not that uncommon. If basically anytime you introduce a new library class, this happens. And that requires you to go hunt down every platform then go through the platform build procedure to verify that your change builds, and so on. And they all use different tools and they have different levels of support, and all the issues we talked about happen, right? Some only work on VS 2017. They use different versions of the like assembler and all types of stuff. So I think if we had the ability to just run CI, I mean, to me, it seems like if we have a requirement that a change in EDK2 has to be integrated in the EDK2 platforms, then we should have the requirement that EDK2 platforms has a similar level of CI support as EDK2. Otherwise, it seems like an unfair requirement to me. So I was hoping we could prioritize actually getting CI there. And perhaps we need to be a little more aggressive. Like, I'm wondering, like, can we just send an email to all of the maintainers and say you need to have your platform in CI by June, and if it's not, we're going to delete your package from EDK2 platforms or something? Like something to kind of get things moving and in gear, because, like I said, I don't see how we can have this requirement without having CI there.
So I'd not be in favor of just, you know, summarily deleting. I think a strong statement that, you know, changes may occur that break.
Well, it's in the history.
The other thing I want to highlight, if you've not seen it, because we do recognize this kind of change that occurs in the EDK2 core packages that sometimes requires like a new lib to be added to all the DSC files that use that core package. We introduced one in the MDE package called mdelibs.dsc.inc. And for example, if there's a new library class that's added to the MDE package that all platforms require, if they just do an include of that mdelibs.dsc.inc, we only need to update the one DSC inc file and all the platforms automatically get the new lib mapping. That is a pattern that can be used to help minimize the number of platform DSC files that need to be updated when there's a new library requirement in a core package. So that's at least a design pattern that we can evaluate to see if we want to use that more broadly to help reduce the number of DSC file edits that we have to do for core feature enhancements.
Yeah, I saw that. In this case, I would be having to introduce that and add it to all of the platforms as well. But the other problem here is that this becomes an extremely tedious exercise because the maintainers don't respond. So it'd be one thing if you had to go do this and then the maintainers would actually give you a reviewed by within a week. But it's almost a guarantee that whenever you send out this patch, you're not going to get responses no matter how many emails you send.
Okay.
That's the case I'm at on even on EDK2 right now. I sent out a patch series that's been there for like 2 weeks, and I've sent 2 reminder emails, and all I did was update OVMF package DSC and emulator package DSC. And I've told the maintainers, all I did was add a library class to your DSC to keep your build working, and I still haven't gotten a reviewed by.
Okay.
So we need some way to say, if you're going to be a maintainer, you need to like actually maintain, or you need to be dropped from there as well, because it's just like a little ridiculous.
It is, and I will say there is an escalation path. If you notice, the stewards are listed as at the entire repo level. So for the EDK2 and for EDK2 platforms, it's Lathholm and myself.
Mhm.
So and those at the repo level can provide the review if there's a maintainer that's not following through. So of course we prefer the maintainers to do their responsibilities with respect to reviews. But if you're seeing blockage there, that is the escalation path. So please feel free that if you're not getting responses in a reasonable period of time, to raise the issue with Mickey, the community manager, and to who's listed in maintainers.txt as the entire repo owners, to raise the issue with them.
Okay. Yeah, I was hoping we'd have some way to more like systematically track and audit how well we're doing on these types of metrics. Like, how often are people waiting to get reviews on patches? I don't think anyone knows right now, you know, like what's the average turnaround time whenever someone sends a patch on the mailing list to actually get it reviewed. So it'd be nice if we had some way to like track those types of metrics, because then we could actually start like figuring out a way to improve it.
Okay.
Right
I
now,
think that's a great topic for Mickey as well, to see if we can start working that. Because as you're trying to highlight, I think, is that if there's slow response or no response, that seems to imply that we don't have the right maintainers for that specific content. And that's really a community issue, to make sure that we have appropriate maintainers with reasonable response times.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I'll bring that up then. Sounds good. I would like to get to some point where we have CI and EDK2 platforms, because I think the original problem still stands that if you're going to do the due diligence to actually make sure that you're not breaking anything, it's extremely difficult right now, and I doubt anyone really does it. I think they like it's because it would require so much time and so many virtual machine images and or tools being flipped around on your system that it seems like a very tedious task to actually do.
Yeah, I actually suspect that the current state of affairs for a lot of the platforms is that, especially the ones that are based on physical platforms, it's more than just doing a review by a maintainer. You know, those maintainers or some other support team has to go and actually evaluate that change and run it on the real platform or some simulated platform with that exact characteristic. And that is possibly a very manually intensive task right now. Which is probably why we're not to the point where we can actually have EDK2 platforms as an official release, because we don't have enough automation across the complete set of ones there. And really only in that 3-month release window can we even possibly, have the idea that the various teams could go try those platforms out with that combined set of all the content at that release point. I agree completely that CI is the only way out of this. And I don't think by just turning up the contrast to say do CI or you get deleted, it's going to fix the problem. I think it's going to require a lot of conversations and figuring out what teams are able to do and support, and come to a roadmap of improvements across all the platforms.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of exacerbated by the fact that there's a pretty diverse set of platforms in there at the moment. And so between Raspberry Pi, x86 systems of various flavors and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of hard to just assume that you're not going to break anything. In a lot of cases, the boot flows are pretty different between different systems there. So I do think it would be, like I said, very beneficial to try to get that at some point. It'd probably definitely just keep things more stable there, if nothing else.
Agreed. And I think from a previous conversation, we were talking about how do we actually deploy a CI job to a real platform. And I think Stephen Shi has some ideas there, or is willing to help with defining that interface. So, I mean, I think those are some of the groundwork that we have to do from a technical feasibility perspective, to say, here's the recipe to be able to go deploy a job out to either a physical or a simulated platform to go get the results. And then it's up to the individual teams to stand up that service, to be able to do that, to be able to like do the boot test, right? Build test is one thing. Actually being able to do the boot test is the one that we need some more help on, but we have to define the interface for that. So I think that's the groundwork this team can work on, is what is that interface that we believe can be successfully used by all the different platform types.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, anything else here? And Michael, I don't know if it makes sense to try to request the maintainer, or, you know, try to get a list of maintainers or interested parties for MediaK2 platforms. And maybe we can set aside one of these meetings to talk about that.
I think that sounds like a good idea. See how many you can get to respond and have interest in showing up to this meeting, or it may have to be in a different time slot, but see if you can get, you know, the primary owner for each group of platforms, if there's a, you know, kind of a common thread there.
You want me to send that email out, or did someone else want to send it?
You spoke last.
Okay. Do you want me to invite them for next week, or is that too soon?
I think it's fine. I think you should see what their feedback is first and maybe try to get to a time that works for a larger group, if there is a larger group.
Okay.
Okay, anything else from anybody? All right, thanks, everybody. Talk next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.